like this is finally working. Awesome. Okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. We're going to do a second one on postmodern theology today, continuing from the first one that we started going through the Cambridge Companion to Postmodern Theology. And we got Tim back, of course, and Shane, and also Greg, who I've talked with once before with Shane, and you can feel free to get us started off there like you usually do, Tim.
All right, yes. So we got over the postmodern hurdles of trying to stream.
Yes.
In the wake of YouTube getting rid of Hangouts, yay for them. No.
Yeah, really dumb on their part.
Yeah, really, really dumb, for sure. But we won't get into that. All
Yeah.
right, so we're doing the second installment of Postmodern Theology. And last time we started with the one essay from the Cambridge Companion to Postmodernism. So now we are starting with the first, well, actually, I want to start with the preface a little bit, and then the first essay in the Cambridge Companion to Postmodern Theology. This is
Is it just Tim or is everybody's
PDF.
Tim, you cut up there for a second.
We lost your audio there for a sec, Tim.
You there?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so we're starting with the Cambridge Companion to Postmodern Theology. All right. So if nobody has any objections or initial questions, let's go ahead and begin.
I was looking at the year, but 2017, is it?
2017. Let me check in my
2003.
copy. Yeah, 2003. So it's not recent, but it's within the thousands. Okay. So those, open your copy, please, to the preface. Now begin there. This is by Van Hooser, since he's the editor. Okay. So Van Hooser says, quote, "To call a theology modern is to situate it in a familiar narrative about the Enlightenment or to point out certain family resemblances, for example, critical, scientific, between the thinking of exegetes and theologians and their secular counterparts. No such consensus exists, however, with regard to the term."
Wait, sorry, what are exegetes?
Exegetes, those that interpret.
Oh, okay.
An exegete is someone who performs exegesis.
Oh, okay.
Okay? This is a theological term in particular reference to the Bible or Scripture.
Okay.
Okay? So he continues, no such consensus exists, however, with regard to the term postmodern. Yet in the past 20 years or so, postmodernity has become a concept that is as indispensable for understanding contemporary Western thought and culture as modernity has been for understanding the past 300 years. For some, postmodernity marks the end of theology. For others, it is a new beginning. What is undeniable is that a number of theologians have now accepted this adjective as an accurate qualification of their approach to theology. Any genuine grasp of the present situation in theology, therefore, must come to grips with the various ways in which these theologians understand and appropriate the postmodern. He continues, Yet postmodernity is an essentially contested a concept as it is an indispensable one, a sure sign of its importance for society and the academy alike. No one discipline has a monopoly on its definition. Indeed, quote, postmodern turns up in contexts as diverse as art and architecture on the one hand, and philosophy and cultural studies on the other. Though its proponents typically resist hegemonic meta-narratives, shades of Lyotard here, that purport to offer universal theories which construe reality from a, quote, God's eye point of view, there is nonetheless something ambitious about the very concept of the postmodern. For to be postmodern is to signal one's disaffection with at least some aspect of modernity. It is to harbor a revolutionary impulse, the impulse to do things differently. Postmodernity is upsetting, intentionally so. Postmodern thinkers have overturned the tables of the knowledge changers in the university, the temple of modernity, and have driven out the foundationalists. Or to take an even older image, postmodern prophets have marched, Moses-like, into Egypt and demanded, "Let my people go." Postmoderns have resisted their harsh modern taskmasters together with the requirement to make epistemological bricks out of the straw of logical propositions and the mud of universal human experience. Postmodernity is perhaps best construed as a, quote, exodus from the constraints of modernity, as a plea to release the other, as a demand to let particulars be themselves, rather than having to conform to the structures and strictures of the prevailing ideological or political system. Whether this exodus from modernity leads to genuine liberation or to a new bondage remains, of course, a matter of dispute. Okay, so I'll stop there. Questions, comments from anybody?
No, it makes sense so far. What about you guys?
Just that comment about escaping the bondages. It's like, no, there isn't a reality. I could be anything, Like,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's
The reality imprisons us, man.
That's right. It's the system, man. The reality is the system, man, trying to keep us down.
Gotta get out of the matrix, man.
That's right.
yeah.
So, Greg, you're new to this discussion. What are your thoughts? I don't know how much you've listened to the previous episodes we've done on postmodernity and how conversant you are in it.
Well, I'm new to the podcast, and I haven't seen the previous. So, and I haven't read the preface. I've now got it in front of me, the Cambridge Companion to Postmodern Theology. I have heard of Kevin Van Hooser because I know someone who was the PhD under him. Postmodernity, postmodernism, postmodern. I come at it because my background is in sociology. So. And I did a master in philosophy, but that's maybe going around and not answering. But it's nice to see here his attempt to define and give some connection with theology, although the language for me is a little bit new, I should say.
So you say you have a background in sociology. Have you ever read Zygmunt Bauman?
Bauman, yeah. Liquid modernity. Right?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so Andrew, how would you define postmodernity? We've spent how many months going over the Cambridge Companion, and we've discussed this with Shane. We've discussed it between ourselves. We've discussed it with Hayden to a small extent.
Well, if we're talking about postmodernism, I guess you could sort of define it as a reaction to the Enlightenment and basically like heavy skepticism and rhetorical deconstruction of aspects of the Enlightenment, like being very skeptical of meta-narratives and science and that sort of thing, and sort of just analyzing the way that collectively agreed upon ideas and definitions form and how they change. And then there's a clear difference between that and the postmodern era and the postmodern condition. But if you talk about just specifically postmodernism, I guess that's the simplest and most concise way I can think of as explaining it.
Okay, Shane, you got anything to add to that?
I might not say it quite right, but I find postmodernism to be very good at observing and deconstructing. It kind of seems obvious based on the definition, but not very constructive. I guess that's not saying very much of the deconstructive thing. But I think my biggest surprise is postmodernism. I find it analyzes and describes things in ways that I find valid and useful. I just think that I find it a little bit groundless, just because it seems to like overreact to the uncertainty of things or the difficulty of asserting things.
It's deliberately groundless. If you say postmodern, like postmodern theology, for example, is the reconstructing the deconstruction of the postmodernism from a theological perspective.
Yeah, I guess it's great for provoking conversation. I just don't know exactly what its utility is, but I mean, maybe it's not supposed to have one. So, yeah,
it's just that, to deconstruct things.
It's descriptive, not prescriptive.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I'm a very prescriptive oriented person.
That's
Okay.
why you probably like the theological aspect of this.
Well, we'll find out what Van Hooser has to say.
And then meat and potatoes, boys.
Okay. All right. So going back to the companion, we'll start with page 3, which is the first essay, Theology and the Condition of Postmodernity, a report on knowledge of God. That's a nice little pun from Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition Report on Knowledge. Okay. So, yeah, this is the first essay, Kevin J. Van Hooser. All right, starting here. So I'll go ahead and read the first paragraph. Van Hooser says, those who attempt to define or to analyze the concept of postmodernity do so at their own peril. In the first place, postmoderns reject the notion that any description or definition is neutral. Definitions may appear to bask in the glow of impartiality, but they invariably exclude something and hence are complicit, wittingly or not, in politics. A definition of postmodernity is as likely to say more about the person offering the definition than it is of the, quote, postmodern. Second, postmoderns resist closed, tightly bounded, totalizing accounts of such things as the essence of the postmodern. And third, according to David Tracy, quote, there is no such phenomenon as postmodernity. There are only postmodernities. Given these 3 points, the task of writing an introduction may seem to be well nigh impossible. Abandon hope, all ye who enter here? Okay. So some things we pull out of here is the avoidance of anything that's totalizing, anything that has an essence of the postmodern, possibly even what a definition is. So I like what David Tracy has to say. There is no such phenomenon as postmodernity, although I would kind of argue with that, especially after I've read very much in Bauman and I'm a fan of his, Postmodernity, Liquid Modernity, but there are only postmodernities. Big difference there.
Yeah.
Well, he can say that not as one individual, so to decenter himself. So for him, there is postmodernity, the way he defines it, but others may define it differently. So you're getting rid of the first person perspective almost here and just going, well, okay, I'm one of many, and therefore we only say it in plural. Does that resonate? Or
that's an interesting point.
Yeah, it does. I mean, there's many different ways that one can define what postmodernity and postmodernism is. Everybody has their own. And what Andrew and I did starting from the very beginning is, Greg, I don't know if you've listened to James and the Giant podcast, the series I did last year in defining what postmodernity was. 9-hour marathon podcast session.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. But I was going through many of the core thinkers identified. Lyotard didn't even touch Derrida, didn't even touch Foucault, so that dispensed with Jordan Peterson's accusations right there. And then I ended with Zygmunt Bauman towards the end, liquid modernity as a sociological phenomenon. But, trying to put your finger on what postmodernism, postmodernity is, people were doing that from the late 70s going on. Then the high watermark was somewhere in the late 80s, and then it was still around in the early 90s, and then it kind of dropped off the face of the earth. Nobody was really paying much attention to it anymore. Until sometime in the early 2000s, where it kind of resurfaces, and we're looking at this here with the Cambridge Companion to Postmodernity, which came out in the early 2000s, and this one was 2003. So these are echoes of it. Now it's spreading out into different areas besides art, architecture, music, philosophy is I tend to stay away from that because I don't subscribe to there being such a thing as a postmodern philosophy.
You can't kill it.
You can't kill it. That's right.
Well, there is nothing to kill, right?
Yeah.
That's right. If it's groundless and there's no definition, there's nothing to kill. It's this amorphous will-o'-the-wisp out there.
Well, does that mean to say there's no modern philosophy? Is that because that's a huge thing? And modern, if it's a period, that covers way too much to be put under any singular label.
Oh, sure. For sure.
So in that parallel, then obviously there's no such thing as a postmodern philosophy either. But then one could say there's no such thing as postmodern theology, which is the title here. It should be postmodern theologies.
Well, yes, I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, but I don't think the idea of postmodernism is to kill modernism entirely, right?
No, it's not. But the thing about this, and again, I covered this in the first episode with James on the Giant Podcast, is that what if we're going to talk about postmodernism? What is modernism? If we're going to talk about the postmodern, what is the modern? So there are some clear definitions, at least in the scholarly literature, about what modernity is when it began. Seems around 1850, in the middle of the 19th century, and this coincided with the rise of the Industrial Revolution. So that ushered in modernity on a large scale, and then it just continued for the rest of the 19th century, going into the early 20th century, and then ever complex forms of modernity spread throughout the 20th century until around the time where I say the fall of the Berlin Wall, maybe even slightly before, when things started to shift. And so modernity was cracking at the seams. In particular, what Bauman did in his descriptions of the Soviet Union, when it came apart, the Soviet Union was modernity par excellence. And then when that fell, you started to see the negative consequences of modernity par excellence, or modernity writ large, just it was not deconstructing itself, but degenerating into something that was sort of early modern or pre-modern.
And Bauman called, in terms of the Soviet Union, Bauman called communism modernism on steroids, right?
Something to that effect. He didn't use those terms, but that's what I used. Communism, yes, is kind of modernity on steroids because it attempts to rationalize and control everything on a large scale.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I would take issue with that to some degree as well. Having lived in the former Soviet Union in two different countries, and I guess seen the after effects, and certainly by the 1980s, it would be hard to make the argument that the Soviet Union as a whole was more modern than a lot of countries. Although there are certain features of those societies that have modern aspects to them, but I don't agree with Bauman's stereotype on that. And
how would you describe it rather than modern?
Modern here just means you're a positivist who believes you can use evidence and rationality to draw conclusions about reality, and that's going to be functionally viable.
And isn't that that wasn't a huge part of the Soviet Union?
Planning was centralized planning.
Sure, yeah, planned economy, yeah. Yeah, in terms of the totalizing logic, I mean, the Soviet Union by the 80s was a different place, and they already had post-positivism. That was also a movement, but that's already coming in the at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th. But the change there, you have the move to literacy as well. That came later than it did in where we're based here now. But I agree with you, everyone here, that it's hard to get a definition. So that's why it's difficult for me a little bit listening to Van Hooser here. For one, because his language is very flowery in its descriptiveness, and I don't know what he's talking about when he means theology, frankly, so far. But that's why it's his companion, so we'll get more into it.
What do you mean exactly by post-positivist? I know what positivists are, but could you unpack that a little bit? You still there, Greg?
Yeah. Yeah, so one of the key figures in here is Vladimir Solovyov. And Solovyov lived almost the exact same years as Nietzsche did. Solovyev or YOV. And he wrote a book called The Crisis in Western Philosophy. Just let me, I'm opening it here right now. And it has Bill as well, if I recall correctly. Against Positivism is the title of the book. The Crisis of Western Philosophy Against Positivism. So it's basically overcoming these tendencies of the modernism, if that's the way you call it. Because once you get to the Soviet Union, they didn't have an enlightenment, right? They didn't have a Renaissance. So modernity, even what it meant, I would challenge Bauman on that. Although, if I recall, he traveled quite extensively, or at least in the Soviet Union. I know he's well read in Russia, at least when I was there. So,
Okay, so you wouldn't call the like the Soviet Union modern in the same way as like a so-called Western country like America or Canada, because you think, according to that book, it didn't experience modernism in the same way as those other places?
well, you brought in modernism, right? And that could be a style or an art rather than a period. So as an epoch, that's something. If it just link with development, like modern is the most developed of something. Here's the modern headphones. Then sure, there's a lot of things they had there. They sent out the first satellite, for example. So modern technology, they had the science technology revolution, which is, sure, there's lots of new cutting edge things there. But in terms of a modernity for the world, and maybe the standard of human development as it dropped from the 60s to the 80s, certainly no, it wasn't comparatively modern with the United States and Canada. Not on everything, but with some key things. And society was breaking apart.
Maybe I can chime in on this. So modernization did not happen organically in the Soviet Union. You brought up an interesting point, Greg, is that yes, Russia did not have an enlightenment as it did in Western Europe. So the ideas, the seeds that were planted for modernization and modernity in Western Europe and then in the Anglosphere did not happen at the same pace, and certainly not in the same paths as it did in the Soviet Union. Rather, you had Tsarist Russia and then the Russian Revolution in 1917, and then aggressive modernization, collectivization of the farms, central planning of economies, and so on and so forth. So it was almost like a giant leap, which kind of was echoed in China in the way it developed. It did not have a Renaissance. It did not have a modernization as it did in Western Europe. So it was like from here to here. And then it spread on a large scale, but I guess you could say to some extent because it did not happen organically and it ballooned very quickly and lasted over the course of 70, even 80 years. When it collapsed, it just collapsed upon itself very quickly. It didn't really break apart. Well, it kind of did. The Soviet satellite states, they broke apart and then they became independent. But the modernization, even in those states, was uneven. Is that a fair assessment, Greg?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, because the resources, the industry developed in certain areas, and then when the Union collapsed and the Commonwealth of Independent States and then the Baltics, et cetera, were formed, some of the resources remained and some were taken back to the mother country. So that and then we're left underdeveloped because of that.
Yeah. So with Bauman, one line that sticks out in his work is the re-enchantment of the world, as his description of what postmodernity is. So instead of the rationalization, modernization, where we can explain everything is centrally planned, secularization, and so on and so forth, once modernity starts to crack, or using his term, liquid modernity, modernization is still with us. But really, it's a lot more slippery than it once was. And some things that we took for granted as being modernized or explained in a certain way no longer apply. And so where I think Van Hooser is going with this and the collection with theology is that the same thing happened, where you had a pre-industrialization, a pre-modern type of theology, organized religion that had existed for centuries. Then in the modern world, it became secular. And this is where Nietzsche and the death of God comes in. But now that modernization has cracked up, splintered apart, and re-enchantment, the resurgence of some kind of a religious or theological outlook on life, but it cannot go back to pre-modern type of theology.
Yeah, interesting.
Okay. So with that out of the way, let me go ahead to the next page. where Van Hooser says, he takes a stand on this, I shall resist describing postmodernity in either conceptual or cultural terms alone. I shall prefer rather to speak of the postmodern condition as something that is at once intellectual, theoretical, and cultural, practical, a condition that affects modes of thought as well as modes of embodiment. Significantly, the first book to treat postmodernity as a distinct intellectual and cultural movement was Jean-François Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition, published in 1979. Okay. A condition is something altogether different than a position. A position refers to one's location in space, or alternately, to one's opinion on a certain issue. The point is that a position, whether geographical or argumentative, can be plotted and specified more or less accurately. Positions are determinate, fixed, definite. A condition is altogether more diffuse, an environment in which one lives and moves and in some sense has one's being. Okay, so that definition I like. It is not a position, but it is a condition. Dovetailing in with what Bauman says too about modernity as a condition, or even before, when you're talking about Jameson, the postmodern condition. It's not a particular position, it's just this, it's like a fog. It envelops things, a situation, an environment. Okay, so the postmodern condition, he continues, this phrase is susceptible of a number of possible meanings, of which 3 are especially relevant. Let's see if we agree on this. 1, a set of circumstances that affects the existence or functioning of something or other. For example, working conditions, living conditions. 2, a state of being or fitness. Athletes, for example, are typically in good condition. Conversely, the term may be used to indicate some ailment or abnormality, for example, a heart condition. One challenge in describing postmodernity is to judge which sense of condition applies, health or dire illness. And the terms are salus for health, that's a Latin term, or illness, crisis, Greek term. Number 3, a stipulation or a requirement that must be fulfilled in order to do something, for example, a condition of entry. What then is the passport into the postmodern? What conditions does postmodernity impose on individual and societies, believers and churches? Most urgently, does postmodernity present us with enabling conditions, and hence with new opportunities and possibilities? Or does postmodernity represent a disabling condition, a condition of impossibility, say, for discovering truth or for talking about God? And then it continues, what does it mean to do theology in the postmodern condition, to do theology under the conditions of postmodernity? This, the governing question of the present work, implies 3 others. 1, is there really such a thing as a distinctly and uniquely postmodern condition? 2, if so, just what kind of a condition is it? 3, is postmodernity a condition from which Christian theology can and should recover, or does postmodernity represent a net gain for Christian faith? To be sure, one characteristic of the postmodern condition is a suspicion of simplistic either-or contrasts. The answer to this latter question, then, may be both and neither nor.
So I think the most obvious question there is, how is that possible that it can be both and neither nor?
Good question. Greg, you got any thoughts on that?
I'm just trying. I have it in front of my eyes as well. The third, that's the to the third one question. The answer to this latter question.
Mm-hmm.
That's the third one. Yeah,
Yes.
I don't like the this notion that Christian theology can and should recover, which implies that it. What's the opposite of recover? Lost.
Yep.
Or something like that. So. Yeah, I think it depends in which theological tradition, because that's what you're going to use when you speak of your theology. And so, again, when you're talking here, he talks about Christian faith. Van Hooser is a Protestant evangelical, as far as I understand. So, if he means that, and that should recover, maybe that's all he's talking about. But there may be other theologies which are strong and sound and were never lost. So that third one, to me, I'm a little baffled by how we can just presume that.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point. So this whole thing about postmodern theology, and I confess I'm not an expert in it. I'm learning as much as we go through this companion as everybody else, is that this seems to be more of a phenomenon, for lack of a better term, within Protestant churches. I don't hear of I don't hear of Catholic postmodernity. Now, why? Because what I know about the Catholic Church is that there certainly were anti-modernist tendencies in the Catholic Church in the 19th century. So there are certain positions or even sects, you could even say, again, for lack of a better term, within the Catholic Church that never bought into modernity to begin with. They resisted it. It never went through the modernizing influence. And Greg, you're part of the same church as Shane, so you know about the Orthodox Church. And the Orthodox Church, as far as I know, never went through a modernist phase. I could be wrong.
That's what I was just going to ask you guys about.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I find interesting about postmodernism is there's certain types of positivistic statements about religion and the use of mixing philosophy and religion that orthodoxy kind of resists in a certain way. There's a lot of things that get reduced to mysteries, as I've said before. So,
yeah,
in a certain sense, there's kind of a common cause between an orthodox theology and a postmodern theology, insofar as you don't want to certain narratives or certain overly positivistic moves are not really allowed to be made.
Like you don't want to essentialize too much.
Yeah, this is something I was reading something today about how it was Saint Gregory of Palamas or Basil the Great was explaining the Trinity, and he was like using philosophical terms, but he wasn't. They were just like I couldn't quite get the nuance there, where it was like we're using this to explain something, but it's just because we need these words to understand it, not that these words are actually describing the thing. It was something like that. I didn't quite get it, and that kind of has a postmodern ring to it in the sense of this explanation makes sense, but it's still not a complete grasping of the thing. Like there's always this unknowability at the end of it. So I don't know if that made sense, but it seems to be very very much into this. So and then again this whole legalistic tradition that you kind of get from being very literalist about the Bible, which is a very Protestant thing to do in a lot of ways. That's very very strongly resisted. They keep talking about how in a non-rational way, by through knowing God, you can come and the Holy Spirit embodying you can see the truth, but it's not really that you've used your rational faculties or your logic or your philosophy per se to come to that conclusion. So
I see what you mean.
Yeah, you recall
it's more of a Protestant thing than a Catholic thing to be literal about the Bible.
Well, you recall from the last time we did this, is that the Western tradition became more rationalistic.
Right.
The Eastern tradition didn't.
Oh, right. We were
again,
talking about the Byzantine Empire.
Right. Shane brings up the key point, is that it still acknowledges the mystery. We don't need to explain everything in a rational manner. We don't need to take everything in the Bible literally as it is. Well, I can't really say that for sure because I don't know too much about Orthodoxy, but but it stresses the mystery. Whereas in the Western tradition over the centuries, and then seeing how it played out, it kind of made sense that secularism would have taken root at some point. The Enlightenment would have happened in the West because that's what the Western tradition was about. Whereas in the East, there was no Enlightenment.
Right.
It was still more or less dominated by the Byzantine Empire, which is the Byzantine Rite, the Eastern Rite. These are the religious underpinnings of what was going on here. And it's not to say that secularism didn't at some point take root. It did, particularly under the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. That was secularism par excellence. But again, that goes back to my earlier point, where there wasn't this gradual organic evolution moving towards secularism. It was religious, and then it wasn't. Just a complete abrupt change.
Right. Okay.
But, my other point is that, yes, I've noticed this whole thing about postmodern theology is really more or less a Protestant thing. I don't see it in Orthodoxy. I don't see it in Catholicism. Don't see it in Coptics either. It's something that's in the Protestant tradition, sort of.
At the
Okay.
same time, I would clarify, and two people at least have done this already. The postmodern era is different than postmodernism as an ideology. At least I would call postmodernism. That's my quickest, most direct answer. It's an ideology. Okay, what kind of ideology? With the denotation of the suffix of the ism there, right? But I think to say that Orthodox or you could name a whole number of people who, to some degree, have the very ancient tradition. They still live in the postmodern world. But to suggest that they've adopted a postmodernist theology, I think is still very confusing, too far to go, how difficult it is to define. Because a modern theologian in the Orthodox Church or even the Catholic Church might be 200 years ago, 500 years ago. That might be modern, when we're talking about the schism. It's certainly not going to be called, modern in the Protestant sense, because the history is much shorter. So I think we have to take into account when we're talking about postmodernity, the different time scales that, if we're just sticking within Christianity, the three branches, how do they look at things now?
Yeah, it's not usually when we're talking about postmodernism, it's not a time scale thing. It's a intellectual tradition thing. So modernism is not, it happened in a historical time, but it was an intellectual tradition, and postmodernists post that tradition. It's not a time scale thing per se. In theory, you could dig up some text that's 1,500 years old that could look at the world in a postmodern way, just by the way they start defining their terms. I don't think it exists, but in theory it could, because it's not dependent upon the time scale. It's not the defining characteristic. So
Yeah, that reminds me also of how Bauman talks about the term he uses is liquid modernity. So, like, he wouldn't necessarily say that we're actually fully in the postmodern era, because we're still retaining remnants of the modern era.
Right. He used the term postmodernity early in the 90s when he started writing on it, because the term had some cachet at the time. Then around 2000, 2001 is when liquid modernity came out, the book. And he abandoned postmodernity because he thought it really wasn't useful anymore, because modernity still was with us. Modernization still was happening. But then it became liquid instead of solid.
Right.
Right. Okay?
Yeah.
All right. So if nothing else, let's go ahead to go to page 6, and I'm going to quickly run through this. So I think he's done a good job here of describing what the postmodern condition is. So he focuses on what are called the turns, the postmodern turns. And in the first paragraph, he is asking the question, is modernity a material or an ideological condition? Okay. And his view is that it's both. Neither simply material nor simply an ideological, but both together. And in other words, modernity and postmodernity are conditions that have both material and ideological aspects. Okay. So the first turn was in arts and humanities, which is where I think if you're using the term postmodernism, this is the most apt application of it. So then he talks about modernist architecture, turning its back on traditional styles, that instead of a beautiful building, instead you have a functional building. Okay, like brutalist architecture, for example. Kind of a functional building, even though some people consider it as high art. I never do. But modernist building does not mean anything but simply serve its purpose. Okay. So then the postmodern turn on architecture is the rejection of a universal form that expresses the essence of a given building. So then you can make it out to be whatever it is you want. Okay. Again, these are very broad brushstrokes that Van Hooser is using here. You could really spend more series of going through exactly what all these turns are. And then continuing with art and architecture, he focuses on things like Picasso's abstract expressionism, Anna Schoenberg, serial music, postmodern artists and writers. Andrew, we've covered this in a previous episode on literature. Okay, So that was the art and architecture term. One of the next terms was culture and society. Okay. So modernity in this context, he says, refers to societal forces and institutional forms. Secularization, industrialization, bureaucratization, embodying the Enlightenment ideals of rationality, individual autonomy, and progress. Okay, that was modernity. The aim of work in modernity was to produce materials necessary for modern life: food, clothes, homes, cars. Okay. A sharp dichotomy between the Puritan work ethic and the hedonistic leisure ethic of self-expression and self-improvement. Okay, this is all modernity. In post-industrialist, postmodern economy, goods are produced not to supply pre-existent needs, but to supply needs that are themselves created by advertising and marketing strategies. So in other words, needs are created, products are produced to satisfy those needs. In other words, consumerism.
Yes, that's what I was just thinking.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's the cultural and society term. Next, we have the philosophical and theoretical term. Okay. So modern thought, he says, was characterized by a drive for certitude, universality, and perhaps above all, mastery. Okay. So postmodern philosophers, yes, he used that term, many of them French intellectuals disillusioned after the Parisian University protests of May 1968, rebelled against the so-called, quote, Enlightenment project that sought universal human emancipation through the light of universal human reason, deployed through the powers of modern technology, science, and democracy. So they reject the idea that reason names a neutral and disinterested perspective from which to pursue truth and justice. Okay. Yes. So there is a continuing debate as to whether postmodernity represents a passage beyond or an intensification of modernity, taken either as a socioeconomic or an intellectual condition. Is the postmodern turn away from modernity or turning in of modernity upon itself? Okay. So these are the questions within the philosophical and theoretical turn. And that's it. So he identifies 3 specific turns. Okay. Questions so far?
Those all make sense to me. What do you guys think?
Laying out the terrain nicely, I think.
Yep.
I didn't hear that, but
I said they're laying out the terrain nicely. I mean, it's good to clarify terms, and I think he's kind of doing that. So yeah.
He's trying to say that it's different. I appreciate that he did that. That it said it's different in the humanities and the social sciences. I think that's important to point out. Because there's no attempt or desire to be or appear even scientific in the humanities. Now that's different depending where you are too, because the Germans and the Russians, for example, they would talk about a historical science, but we don't call history a science in North America. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't think he deals well with the culture society term, but that's because that's my area. So, and that's not his area. So, but to tie it with secularism or secularization or a secular movement, I think there's a lot more that needs to be unpacked in the way that he's talking about it, because secularization, the rationalization of the world, was already written about at the beginning of the 20th century by Max Weber. So saying that this happened, in the postmodern turn, well, this has already been being talked about before what he would identify as the postmodern turn, and then that also requires a time rather than it being the ideology. So I'm confused by how he's addressing this, but maybe it's just me. So there's interesting things in here.
Yeah, just for clarification, secularization, bureaucratization, and rationalization, that was the hallmarks of modernity, not postmodernity.
Yeah.
So yes, Weber was the first one to do detailed studies of modernity as it was happening, particularly in bureaucracy, the rationalization of the organization. So then with postmodernity, all bets are off with that.
Yeah.
I don't want to seem flippant when I say that, but that's one thrust of it.
Well, but let's clarify then, if we can. Isn't it postmodernism rather than postmodernity?
What?
Well, okay. So another way to clarify this, I brought this up with Andrew in a previous episode, and I forget where I saw it, but it was in a theory book. the way you could describe it is using three terms. One is modernization, another is modernity, and the last one is modernism.
Yeah.
So modernism applies to something that's an art.
Mm-hmm.
Modernization is the process of moving from a pre-modern, or you could even say primitive, to a modern state of affairs. Running water, flush toilets, toothpaste, electricity, all these kinds of things, modernization. And then modernity is the state of affairs, this sociological phenomenon in which people find themselves. So many different ways that you can define modernity, which itself, I think, merits a separate series about going through what have scholars defined as modernity is. But Van Hoover focuses on secularization, bureaucratization, and rationalization. Three hallmarks of modernity.
Right.
Modernism is kind of a reaction to what was happening within modernity.
Yeah, I mean, I would have trouble linking secularization to modernity. I think he's out of the woods on that. But
you wouldn't say that there was more of a belief in science and more of a belief in that and less of a belief in it sort of broke down some of the more fundamentalist religious views in a way or something like that?
No, I don't. I don't have that attachment because to me it's the postmodernism, the ideology, rather than being the period of time. Because there was great
I'm talking about
religions.
modernism, not postmodernism, or modernity, I should say, not
That's
modernism.
yeah. No.
Sorry.
So in this instance, it works for both. I mean, there's a concept that the mixed martial arts use, which is your cultural confession. So this guy's talking as a Christian Protestant running around in academia in America. So, I mean, I imagine I think Gregory's point might be that in some facets of life, in some cultures, in some places, religion continues on as it does. But if you're running around in an academic American context over the last 100 years, the idea that it hasn't been secularizing itself or public life hasn't been secularizing itself more and more, I think that's de facto the case. I mean, I wouldn't think that requires a lot of justification, even if you could say, well, even as academia was secularizing, the Americans were, there's the Bible Belt or the Bush era resurgence of the evangelical religion, so they started having more influence. But by and large, from the academic liberal elite, whatever moniker you want to use, there's definitely areas of life and facets of life that are clearly trending in that direction. So
yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to say. That's an important point too, that this sort of thing occurred much more in you brought up mixed mental arts, and what in mixed mental arts Hunter Motz calls weird culture, Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic cultures. So not necessarily in other cultures. But yeah, I think that's a good point too. Like I'm thinking even of like pragmatists like William James and John Dewey, for example, were trying to separate some particular aspects out of religion to literally be more pragmatic about it or something like that.
With Dewey, there's more of the civic religion.
Yeah, he's more into politics explicitly too.
Right.
Well, yeah, you'd have to go into Peirce if you want to bring in if you want to bring in the theology in there. The two you mentioned are not.
Yeah. Peirce is more of the founder. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, just to underscore the point is that when modernization was happening in the 19th century, certainly it wasn't consistent all over the world. And even to this day, you still have some pre-modern cultures, although far less so than there once was.
Yeah.
Bruno Latour wrote a book called "We Have Never Been Modern."
Yeah,
which is an interesting twist on this too. So,
interesting.
Subject of another episode.
My to-read list now.
Yes.
What's that one called?
We Have Never Been Modern.
We've Never Been Modern. That sounds interesting.
And he's a comparable figure to Zygmunt Bauman, more cited, but living now. Zygmunt Bauman died just 2 years ago. The other name to bring in, and just because I want to come back to what Shane said, it's sort of de facto. There's some truth in it, but I want to bring in David Martin and then Charles Taylor, the Canadian, because they've been pretty consistent in overturning what kind of was a staple for a while in the social sciences, was secularization as a thesis, that it's inevitable, rationality, the Weber thesis, and secularism is taking over the world. Secularizing is happening, it's inevitable. But David Martin, and I'm going to just put in the title of a paper he wrote here, it's called Towards Eliminating the Concept of Secularization. And then the big book by Charles Taylor, A Secular Age. These both go against this this narrative that we're automatically, just because of who we are now, because of more science and technology saving time, and therefore religion is now unimportant, and therefore we should have secular institutions where religion is not visible publicly. And what both Taylor and Martin argue is that religion is not disappearing. It's changing form because there's more options. You're not in a society where there's one religion. In a pluralistic society, there's multiple religions, but people are not less religious. So to me, that sort of betrays the logic of the old view, which is that secularism is inevitable. I think that's important in this too, because if you're saying postmodern theology is just part of a secularized society and therefore postmodernist theology makes sense, which it doesn't seem like he's saying, but he's worried or fearful or expressing caution about it, then that's a different conversation, I think.
Well, I don't think the idea is that secularism is inevitable, and I think advocating for secularism and getting rid of God, that sounds to me only like something like that people like militant atheists do.
When you talk about militant atheists, one of the more famous ones, particularly in the U.S., was Madeleine Murray O'Hair. You ever heard of her? Yeah. She was the first public atheist who was a militant atheist, really charging hard. I think she started in the 60s, maybe even the 50s. And I remember hearing about her here and there in the 80s. So she was still alive at the time. And she was one of the first. She did this even before Dawkins ever came on the scene, pushing an atheist agenda, that how we need to support the separation of church and state. We need to get God out of the schools and blah 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 and all that stuff. Okay, me having gone to Catholic school, it was just part of the package. I never went to public school where it was not religious at all. And that's what, and I was thinking about that this morning, and I have to laugh. It's because, all the hoopla about Dawkins and that, it's just like, what about Madeleine Murray O'Hair? She was around at that time.
Well, her story is hard because of how it ended, right?
Yeah.
Maybe that's why people are quiet on her.
Yeah, she was murdered.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd never heard of her before.
In a grisly way, if I remember, not nice.
No, it wasn't nice.
Wow. Not one of those nice murders. Yeah.
Well,
no.
Just teasing.
Yeah, so she dropped off the radar, but I don't think she was really that relevant going into the late 80s, early 90s at the time.
So she was relevant in the 70s?
Yeah, I mean, the reason why she got such notoriety is because definitely at a time like the 50s and the 60s, when you had more people who identified as religious, some kind of a religious affiliation, that even though the American society was secularizing quickly, you still had lots of people who identified as religious. I mean, John F. Kennedy, for example, the only Catholic president that the U.S. has ever had, that was something, back in 1960, that was something that was previously unheard of. You're gonna have a Catholic as president? No. Good Protestants, Episcopalians or Presbyterians or whatever it was. So it still mattered even back in the 60s.
And John F. Kennedy gave a great speech about that you can still find on YouTube about addressing him being a Catholic head on. To riff on what Gregory said about secularization, I think you do draw a really good point, and I think you see this now with some of these. I don't know if you guys, those guys who did the recent postmodernist hoaxes. You got the guy from the West Coast, James Lindsay. Anyways, he worked.
Oh yeah,
Yeah. So
those
I
hoax
would
papers.
agree.
I forget what they're called.
But some people who advance a narrative of being secular, I mean, I would contend that they're acting in a very religious way. They're just worshiping a different type of God or structuring the religion differently, right?
That's a Jordan Peterson essentialist narrative, though, which sort of seems like against the idea of being against essentialist narratives. Like, you don't know how other people think.
Well, I mean, just to come back to the postmodernist point, right? So if there is a postmodern theology, it's you're not going to define your religiosity in the same terms, right? So I'm just trying to say, I think you can kind of weave both ideas together and say, even as you're getting this apparent push for secularization, some people are manifesting their theology in a kind of postmodern, lacking a grand narrative, not so concerned with everything being consistent kind of way. Maybe it's ultra individualistic in the sense that you can't put a general narrative and lump a whole bunch of people into this new religion. But you
Cafeteria Christianity.
Pardon me?
Yes, yeah.
Pardon me?
Cafeteria Christianity.
Cafeteria Christianity.
Yeah, might be one, could possibly be one example of that. But either way, all what I just said is consistent with the idea that, you know, man has not become a less religious creature. Man has not become a more rational creature. And I think, I mean, yeah, this is what Peterson often says to Harris, and I think the evidence backs it up, and Haidt talks about it too a lot, where you don't strip away one set of superstitious, well, I don't consider them superstitious, but what might be called superstitious beliefs or religious principles from people, and all of a sudden, boom, all that's left over is the rationality and empiricism. You know, you still have all those predispositions to circle around certain concepts or idol worship or fault parade axioms.
Mm-hmm. That's why one of the things that people say about the postmodern era, for example, and even the postmodern condition, perhaps, is this thing we've been seeing lately of people getting religious about their political ideologies, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So if we could put a pin in that, this is a good segue into Van Hooser is going to be discussing just briefly Lyotard, the postmodern condition. Okay.
If I can interject with just one, just for a very short one, do you mind for a moment?
Sure. Go ahead.
No.
Just to tie on what Andrew just said, it sounds to me almost like an alternative term here would just simply be contemporary. Rather than having to call it postmodern, it just means like right now, this is what people are doing.
Yeah.
And then it avoids any linkage with that label. Just anyway, that came up to mind when what you were saying there, that might be another way. So sorry to interrupt.
Right. No problem.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Okay. So we move to page 9, the section of Report on Knowledge and Belief. Okay, so quickly, he cites Jean-François Lyotard, The Postmodern Condition, which came out in 1979. Okay. So, quoting Lyotard says, modern is any science that legitimates itself with reference to a meta-discourse, making an explicit appeal to some grand narrative. For example, the Einsteinian or Darwinian paradigms. So then there are 3 conditions for modern knowledge. Van Hooser is paraphrasing Lyotard here. The first is the appeal to meta-narratives is a foundationalist criterion of legitimacy. Legitimacy is an important term here. Number 2, the outgrowth of strategies of legitimation and exclusion, prioritizing one over the other. This is the most legitimate versus others that are less legitimate or even illegitimate. And number 3, a desire for criteria of legitimacy in the moral as well as the epistemological domain. The key factor, Van Hooser continues, in Lyotard's analysis is the role of meta-narrative, a master story that serves as a comprehensive explanatory framework for everything else. Narratives which subordinate, organize, and account for other narratives. So, leading into this, the quality of the postmodern is the skepticism against modern, the suspicion of an overarching meta-narrative, and legitimation that appeals to a meta-narrative. Okay, so there's a delegitimation process that is going on within postmodernity.
Within
Right.
Right. Okay, so Van Hooser continues. Lyotard defines postmodernity in terms of a loss of faith in such grand narratives. The postmodern condition is, quote, one of incredulity toward meta-narratives. The grand narrative has lost its credibility, regardless of whether it is a speculative narrative or a narrative of emancipation. For example, postmoderns no longer accept the story that science tells to legitimate itself, namely that it contributes to human freedom and well-being. Postmodernity, in short, cuts meta-narratives down to size and sees them for what they are, mere narratives. Western science loses considerable prestige when viewed in terms of the story white Europeans tell about the natural world. The mark of the postmodern condition of knowledge, then, is a move away from the authority of universal science toward narratives of local knowledge.
So what is meant by mere narratives there?
So instead of there being a meta-narrative, or science is, according to Lyotard, science is the privileged narrative. At least that's how it's fashioned itself to be. The one that is the only one that seems out of many narratives that is obsessed with its own legitimacy. Science over everything else. You can explain everything by science. Science is what we all use. Okay.
Right.
That's only one narrative among many other narratives. There are sociological narratives. There are magical narratives. There are theological narratives. One time back in the Middle Ages and even before, you explain the world in certain terms that are not scientific because science had really not come onto the scene yet. So with modernization, you then had the prioritization of the scientific discourse. It obsessed with its own legitimation. This is the chief narrative among many other narratives. But now with the postmodernity, that faith has been lost, and now it's reverting back to something that was not quite before, but science has lost its supreme position as the most legitimate narrative. Now you just have localized narratives.
Right.
Okay?
That's heavily disputed, of course, right?
Okay. Please, Greg, chime in.
Or maybe I'm the only one that thinks it's disputed here, and I should wait for others to.
No. This is a discussion, please.
Yeah.
The floor is yours.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. There's some who would try to delegitimate, if that's the right word, or to say science doesn't have the authority that it once did. Whereas we're at the same time when we're facing something that I think needs to be brought in as an alternative ideology to come into the discussion of what would postmodernism mean, which would be scientism.
Yes.
The idea that science has, the only knowledge that's real knowledge is scientific knowledge, and if you want to get an understanding of the world, and world means the natural world, because the naturalism is the ideology that only nature exists, then you got to use the scientific method, and then it takes on this authority that's almost become almost a worldview. So, I think if we're going to say that science is authority, we also have to take into account that part of this postmodern theology, not modernist theology, but postmodern theology, simply has to deal with the so-called authority crisis in science when it turns into scientism,
which is a fetishization of the scientific method.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it.
So, again, the way I read Lyotard is that nobody is saying that science. You completely throw science out.
Yeah.
It is not the supreme narrative that it once was, the meta-narrative.
But was it ever? That's what I'm asking. So,
yes, and that's a
science, reason, progress.
Right. Was it ever something that was primary? I guess you could argue it was to a certain extent, particularly when it arrived on the scene and as it was progressing through the Enlightenment, where more secularization was happening. The quote superstitions of theology were chased away. That didn't mean that people stopped being theological, just that the discourse changed. So then it gained steam as it was moving through the 19th century. Modernization was increasing, blah, 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 all of this. All new discoveries because of science, but then science hits a wall. Science can't explain everything anymore that it once did. So then it falls from its perch, bound to mere narratives. Again, this is Lyotard's thesis. Doesn't say everybody agrees with it. Okay?
Okay.
So Van Hooser continues in the next paragraph, and this is where I like he's using theological languages here. Eating from the postmodern tree of knowledge occasions a new, quote, fall and loss of innocence. No longer can we aspire to the knowledge of angels, much less a God's eye point of view. How then are we to make judgments as to true and false, right and wrong? Lyotard acknowledges that the central issue of postmodernity is the possibility of ethics, that is, right action. Lyotard, for his part, is content to live with, quote, little narratives. Yet there are many narratives, and this plurality is what makes the postmodern condition one of a legitimation crisis. Whose story, whose interpretation, whose authority, whose criteria counts, and why?
God's.
Right. So at bottom, it's an authority crisis.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I remember writing a paper a number of years back, and it wasn't about postmodernism, but I brought up that song from Eminem, and then in the song, I'm not sure if it's Slim Shady. There might be another one. And he says, "quote I am whoever you say I am."
Oh yeah, I am whatever you say I am. If
well, the real Slim Shady, please stand up.
I say I am. Yeah.
We're the real postmodernists. Please stand up. Please stand up. Please stand up. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, death of the author as well. Again, but I wanted to tie it in here too, just because we're stuck with we're on Lyotard right now. That one aspect of this too would be how much have the French influenced this in particular. So Baudrillard is another name. People familiar through The Matrix, but others as well. And then you've got Latour, who's quite different because Latour is Catholic. So he's not going to admit, look, all that stuff from the past is wrong. He's going to be protecting tradition to some degree as well. Whereas I think Lyotard I read and I just, I remembered, going through it and going, look, I don't have to accept the whole framework in which he's framing it. This is the way things are. I don't see that here. And by turning to Charles Taylor.
It seems like you're describing what he just said about mere narratives, though.
That Lyotard's is one of multiple?
Yeah, because you just described another one about the Catholic guy you mentioned, about how that would be different.
Yeah, fun fact, the French theorists who are most often cited, they weren't all necessarily postmoderns. Yeah. You have Latour, who was Catholic. You also have Paul Ricoeur, who was Catholic. Yeah. And he was more into hermeneutics. And he was contemporary with the May 1968 people, Deleuze included. So it's not really consistent across the board.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right. So pressing along, the next section is, I'm just going to quickly go through these. So particular themes in postmodernity, reason. Okay. So postmodernists reject the epistemological foundationalism that proclaims, come let us reason together on the basis of shared experience and shared logical categories. It is not that postmoderns are irrational. They do not reject reason, but reason with a capital R. They deny the notion of a universal rationality. Reason is rather a contextual and a relative affair. What counts as rational is relative to the prevailing narrative in a society or institution. Postmodern rationality, we may say, is narration-based.
Okay, so am I hearing this correctly? Because I'm hearing them talk in a way where they're basically saying everything is relativistic. There is no absolute.
No. Be careful when you say that, Shane. Don't say it's relative. Don't say it's relative necessarily.
Relativistic? Is that the right one then?
Don't say it's relativistic.
Relativistic is different than relative because he quotes reason is rather a contextual and relative affair. I think maybe that's what he's responding to.
Yeah, it's not relativistic. Don't make that mistake.
Okay, I don't understand the distinction. I'm not as Gregory and me have a difference. Like he's very precise in his language, and I'm more.
Okay, Andrew, do you want to unload on relativism?
Well, I think to go back to the point about like plural narratives, like I think the word contextual is more key there. Like you can be reasonable depending on the context, but how reasonable you are and what you mean as being reasonable can change depending on the context. It's not as if there's this capital R reason that's an essentialist way of looking at reason that applies to everything, everywhere, in all situations, at all times.
Right.
I agree with that. I'm just, to me, I'm fine with contextualizing things, but like I believe in an absolute reality outside myself. And obviously, depending on your context or your lens or whatnot, you're going to look at things very different way. You're going to highlight very different things. You're going to see different worlds. But above and beyond that, there is still that absolute outside yourself, even if you might never be able to access it in a coherent way between two people in the same room with nothing in it. You know, like the easiest context where you think you can eliminate contextual differences, right?
Okay,
But,
so Shane, would the term perspectivalism be more palatable?
I'm not so worried about the term. I'm just wondering if you guys are hearing the same thing. Is he trying to imply that there is no capital T truth as well? That there's no capital T rationale?
Let's go to the next section.
Just capital R reason. Would you disagree? Would you say that there is a capital R reason that applies to all situations?
On that, or do you want to go ahead, Shane?
Well, as a theist, I have to say yes, and we'll just throw it over to Gregory. Then we'll let Tim continue, because apparently he's gonna get into the. Usually that happens when you read things. The question that your mind has is what they answer next. So.
Yes, there is a section after this that is truth. But Greg, go ahead. What do you want to say?
Well, he uses the term universal rationality, and so maybe it was universal rather than absolute that he was opposing. And I agree that contextual is an important question here. But this reason with the capital R to distinguish from a small r, then one could argue, well, whenever did people, basically idolize, worship, reason, and then we're just going back to enlightenment here. But we're not talking about modernity only, because literally, 100 years after this praise of reason, already reason has fallen out, and 100 years before it's not worshipped in that way. So I don't know if it ever was. It was. Then you have to also bring in, well, it was a European Enlightenment, and India didn't face it, and China didn't face it, and they never, worshipped reason like that, or maybe they did at a different period, and we don't even bring that into the conversation. But in Europe at a time when you had the philosophers with Voltaire and others, and Kant comes in, the Critique of Pure Reason, and now reason gets elevated, like, yeah, that'll save us, as an alternative salvation narrative almost. For some people, but the theists, the religious theists who are going through the Enlightenment period, just like those in the Renaissance, are not losing their religion. They're not idolizing reason, but they're still using that small r reason. So that's why it also gets confusing about how postmodern is just going back when maybe it never left.
That's an interesting point. I mean, I would go back to kind of what we were talking about before, like in terms of weird culture, like you could go like rationalism and reason go all the way back to like Socrates in ancient Greece, and there have been like philosophical traditions since then. So like in terms of Western culture, I guess you could loosely define it as that happened, but like you're saying, definitely not necessarily in all cultures at all times either.
Yeah. Okay. So next page 11, there is a section truth. So I'll just go ahead and read the whole thing. Van Hooser says, quote, "The above rejections combine to form a grand refusal of modernity's metaphysical project, namely, the project of mastering natural reality in a comprehensive conceptual scheme. Postmodernists reject unifying, totalizing, and universal schemes in favor of new emphases on difference, plurality, fragmentation, and complexity. Postmoderns are suspicious of truth claims, of getting it right. Upon hearing the assertion that that's the way things are, postmoderns are likely to respond, that's the way things are for you. Truth in this view is a compelling story told by persons in positions of power in order to perpetuate their way of seeing and organizing the natural and social world. According to Michel Foucault, behind every discourse on truth, there lurks a rhetorical posturing, Knowledge claims are violent impositions by powerful institutions. Universal truth claims are simply masks for ideology and the will to power.
He would say that.
Okay, Shane, yes. Go on.
I was just being funny. I mean,
Okay.
but in all seriousness, like, I mean, yeah, that's just all postmodernism. Like, that's just one narrative among many about why people are speaking in that way. Willing to power. I mean, that's just why are we going to privilege his motivational schema for why people make statements over another. So
I think Foucault is kind of using deliberately provocative language there. Like if you look at some of his other writing, for example, when he talks about power specifically, he means like correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, but I think like in this example it's more likely that he kind of means that if you're putting forward one narrative of truth, you're prioritizing that narrative over other narratives, so that narrative has power over the other narratives. And then when we make truth claims, it's through our ideological perspective. So I don't know, like, does that sound accurate, Tim?
Well, it's a criticism of the correspondence theory of truth, we'll say. That
Right.
whatever one perceives or whatever one is describing exactly how it is in reality. Okay, that's a fundamental criticism, correspondence theory.
Right.
What Foucault is getting at in terms of discourse, okay, so there are certain ways that discourse is structured, scientific discourse. Whatever appears to you is structured by your discourse. If you're a science or a physicist or a biologist or whatever it is, you're going to see things in a certain way. You're going to use language in a certain way. Even theologians use a discourse in a certain way, however it's structured. So it's not to say that a scientist and a theologian can't speak to one another. They certainly can. But what exists in the one's world isn't necessarily going to exist in the other's world because of the way their discourse is structured. That's a Foucauldian way of looking at it. That's not getting really down to brass tacks in the way that you use it. He brings up an interesting point about discourse, language, how language structures perceptions and things like that, which is not simply unique to Foucault. This is also like core philosophy of language type stuff. Does language accurately reflect reality? When Hayden comes on board and we start talking about Rorty, we're going to see that that's not really the case. Definitely Rorty was very much influenced by Foucault. But this criticism of the truth claim, okay, truth statements, propositions, like core analytic type philosophy. Okay?
One idea that I just kind of occurred to me as I heard about that, I'd like to see you guys if this makes sense. So when you're talking about this totalizing of narratives or launching one grand narrative everyone has to buy into, or one person saying my way of discoursing or my theory of truth is the primary one. I wonder if that's not similar to the Christian critique of like trying to build a Tower of Babel, right? When you try to have this human construction that can give you like the ability to see truth, and it doesn't involve God. Like you have your own method that can answer all the questions for you, and how evil and fallacious such an approach would be. So maybe this is another overlap between postmodernism and kind of the Christian/Orthodox perspective, in the sense that both are on board with, good luck trying to build your perfect little theory here, friends, where you think you can answer all things and see all things. It's not going to work. And maybe, obviously the reason why that's not going to work is going to be different for a Christian, for a postmodernist, but they're still critiquing the same thing. Does that make sense at all to you guys?
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point, because I thought about this too. With the whole modernization type of a thing, you could compare it to building the Tower of Babel. Although, we wouldn't specifically use the term like the modernization project in building the Tower of Babel. What happened is that God struck down those men who was building the Tower of Babel, and what happened? Polyglossia, many different languages. Now the people who were involved in building the Tower of Babel could no longer speak to one another. So riffing on, one of Bauman's theses is that this is where the re-enchantment of the world came in. So what you originally took for granted, because in effect everybody spoke the same language and everyone had the same schema. Now nobody can speak to one another. This is an extreme example. Nobody can speak to one another. And the schema that existed was just blown apart. Now everybody has their own little way of looking at things. And so this re-enchantment is you're not taking for granted what had already existed. And so you have to kind of work your way back to some ground of understanding. But there's never going to be a complete 100% one-to-one type of a grafting of one to the other because of this sort of re-enchantment of the world, this postmodern condition that we find ourselves in.
Okay, so postmodernists basically agree then that God struck down the Tower of Babel of modernism and rationality, and giving us all these different narratives so we could rediscover Him as the truth. Seems
Well, that's one way of describing it.
that was meant to be done.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah, I don't know the context in which Bauman is proposing re-enchantment. I don't know what he means by that. He doesn't mean what Weber did. Weber was the disenchantment of the world, and that's
Right.
Overlap with the conversation on secularism or rationality.
I think what he was doing is that he was speaking against Weber. Weber, as he was describing secularization and modernity, is disenchanting the world. No longer do we have to use God language or speak about fairies or something supernatural or anything like that. We have modern scientific language in which we can describe it. But now with re-enchantment that's a reversal. You can't go back to what it once was, but you're showing the cracks of what modernization has wrought.
So my issue then is, what does the re-enchanting involve? I wrote my undergraduate thesis, and the subtitle was Re-enchanting Education. I wrote it on Max Weber.
Okay.
But I guess I'm asking you, Zygmunt Bauman was Jewish. Was he a religious Jew or a secular Jew? I don't know the answer.
I think he was a secular Jew. I think he was a secular Jew.
So in terms of re-enchantment, разочарование is in Russian. It's just sort of like disappointment almost. That's something sounds similar, but it's almost like no belief in anything enchanting, including religion. And for me, that if Bauman's not saying re-enchantment, then I don't know what he re-enchantment in terms of religion. If he's saying it in a secular sense, I don't know what he means either by re-enchantment. I think it's a pretty empty term, but I haven't read that text of him. So,
well, can you talk a little bit about your academic work on the re-enchantment of education, which you understand it to be?
Well, the question of I used the text. I actually used the one from many you may know this Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah,
and he uses the distinction of a church of reason. It overlaps with what we're talking about, and that was I quoted from that's what he thought the university was trying to be. Mm-hmm. And I used that in contrast to the Weber disenchantment thesis, but. Persig himself was, I think, Buddhist. So when we're talking re-enchantment, Solovyov might be example. But I don't know, like, up not just religion, but mythology, right? And other symbolism, Jonathan Pageau, for example, as well. Is that re-enchanting now? Because I find when I listen to people like Foucault, I'm really turned off. Look for power everywhere where you'll find it. Okay, thanks. But I don't see that everywhere. And secondly, I don't see the absence of truth. I think, truth is axiomatic to some, So it's capital T truth, as in I have the view of everything. Well, that's not hard to knock that over. But to claim that now truth is somehow degraded.
It's that the capital T truth, like you said, is degraded, not necessarily lower T truth.
Some of Foucault's later works were lectures on truth-telling, parousia, a Greek term. And I've been thinking of doing maybe a short series on that. This is the late Foucault. within
Okay.
the last decade of his life. And I think that's fruitful to look at, truth-telling versus truth. Because even Wittgenstein had some criticisms against truth and against certainty, taking it as an absolute truth or things like that. But that's, I don't want to necessarily go down that rabbit hole. It's just we're doing a quick survey from Van Hooser about all the hallmarks of what postmodernity is for him.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
can we
And
put a
if
pin in that?
in short, if re-enchantment requires turning away from truth, I don't think that's re-enchanting.
Okay.
So you guys are enchanted by truth?
On this some enchanted evening?
Hey, you guys are probably hearing the crickets because I'm outside. I know Shane's inside.
Hey, that's
but-
enchanting. Yes, I'm hearing that you're.
The enchanting
And
crickets
a
in
few
the
dogs
enchanting true world.
That's okay. So if we could, I'd like to press on. So
Okay.
quickly, we have a section on history and we have a section on self. So quickly on history. Van Hooser says, modern thinkers are nothing better than to tell stories about universal history. From Kant to Hegel to Marx, modern thinkers have attempted to tell the story of humanity, usually in terms of the progress of the race. Key term there, progress. Postmodern historians reject the premise that history moves according to a unified linear logic. Discontinuity, rather than continuity, is the postmodern watchword. So we are not progressing to something that is higher than what came before. It might be that we progress for a time, we back up, we take a different path, we progress a little bit more, we back up, we take a different path, maybe take another different path entirely. There's nothing linear to this. That's what postmodernism is highlighting.
I'll
Okay.
jump in there if no one else will.
Okay. And then there's the self. Okay, it follows from the above that there is no one true way of recounting one's own history, and thus no one true way of narrating one's own identity. But the self is decentered in other ways as well. Postmoderns reject the notion that the person is an autonomous individual with a rational consciousness that transcends one's particular place in culture, language, history, and a gendered body. Contra Descartes, the self cannot even know its own mind. According to Paul Ricoeur, mentioned it before, consciousness is not given, but a task for which we find ourselves always already immersed in an embodied situation. Postmoderns do not believe in the meta-narrative of the knowing subject. The postmodern self is not a master of, but subject to the material and social and linguistic conditions of a historical situation that precedes him or her. So, one point to highlight here, they're not talking about a soul. They're talking about the self.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, one can argue is that, well, if you take a theological approach to this, there is an everlasting soul. The soul is an individuating quality of the person, blah, blah, blah. This is not what the postmodernists are getting at.
Right.
Am I right in assuming that they're implicitly naturalists, the way they're describing this?
Can you be more specific?
Well, I mean, by well, I mean, from like a theistic perspective, there are certain essences, there are certain capital T truths that exist on some level. So there's limitations on describing those. That comes limitation to context, et cetera, et cetera. But it seems that the way they're making those declarative statements or those things assumes only naturalistic explanations, because the fact that you can't describe it means it implies it's not there. Like when they say there's no individual.
It doesn't imply that it's not there necessarily.
Well, that was my question, right? When they say there is no individual, just these facets that are seen that way, that implies, because you can't naturalistically define it that way, because you're always going to hit up against the limitations of discourse, perspective, context, etc.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the key term here is, there are a couple key terms here. Subject versus self. Okay. So Shane, I recommend you go back to James and the Giant podcast, the first episode, where I go through some points about what the structuralists have to say about subjects. The subject is not the self. The subject is not gendered necessarily. When you're talking about the subject is like a grammatical subject, for example, the I. I am talking to you guys presently. I am sleepy and I'm going to be going to bed pretty soon. Okay, what does this I refer to? Does it refer to an incorporeal soul? Does it refer to an incorporeal self? Does it refer to a structured self in whatever way? Maybe yes, maybe no. We can't say. But it is a subject. Just like there is a linguistic subject or a sociological subject or an economic subject. Many different kinds of subjects here. So one could say theologically that, yes, there are some particular truths, is that there is an immoral soul and blah, blah, blah. But that's not what we're talking about here. Particularly with a linguistic self or, even one's national identity. One is American versus Russian versus German versus Thai, whatever it is. Okay. That is somewhat contextual. Definitely contextual to whatever kind of discourse you're using to describe that particular subject. Does that help, Shane?
Okay, so just in a nutshell, then they're sidestepping the question of absolute truth or true nature, capital T truth, by saying we're just addressing the subject which exists in this realm of perspectivism, contextualization being so important.
Right. The subject or a self. Even the concept of a self is problematic. You take Hume. What does Hume say? What does Hume say in short? Whenever I try to find myself, I always stumble upon some perception or impression of perception of something. So therefore, it's an oversimplification of the argument. There is no such thing as the self versus what other philosophers had said. And in particular, we are against what Descartes had to say about the cogito, which is the thinking thing. That was primary. Now, Descartes had also said is that God was one of the innate ideas that was present in all of us. Okay, that's an ontological proof of that. But there is no cogito. There is no unchangeable self. We're not talking about soul here. We're talking about self and a subject. What's that, Andrew?
There's no homunculus inside our brain that's thinking all our thoughts.
That's a good one. There's no homunculus.
And also, like, in terms of the self, I mean, it seems like the point is that there's no essential eternal self that is never changing. Like, you change from the time you're born until the time you die, and everyone changes depending on their interaction with their environment.
Yes, or even what you choose to identify yourself as. So some people identify themselves all the time by their professions. Other people don't place as much emphasis on their professions. I'm a family man, father, I'm a member of my church, I'm a teacher, I volunteer, there are many different ways that you can define oneself in a certain context.
Yeah.
Okay?
Okay, that's good enough for now, thank you.
Okay.
I'm quite troubled by both of these statements, and I don't think I think there's insinuations that are in fact misrepresentations. I don't think I, as in I am a self, has disappeared, but I would agree that discussion of self is more common now than discussion of soul or discussion of spirit. But the two paragraphs, I disagree with them immediately. First, in the history one, where he says, postmodern historians reject the premise that history moves according to a unified linear logic. Okay. And discontinuity rather than continuity is a postmodern watchword. Okay. Yet evolutionism is widespread nowadays, where people use the term evolution to describe simple change over time. And evolution is a continuity-based theory. And it's a linear-based, at least. So to say that postmodernism has gone beyond
that depends on your view of evolution, though. Like, there's punctuated equilibrium in sociobiology, for example.
Yes, I would agree with that. Also, that with more contemporary, yes, we could use that term, contemporary theories of evolution, they've gone beyond Darwin. Punctuated equilibrium, that's Stephen Jay Gould's term, and that's from decades ago. And evolution is, one could say, not really moving from an inferior to a superior being or an organism. Rather, what's at the core of Darwin's theory? Survival of the fittest.
Mm-hmm.
Whichever organism is best equipped to survive in that particular environment. So the dinosaurs were the fittest at one time. Then they died out. They went extinct. They were no longer the fittest. Then, right now we're in the age of man, still are. Hard to say whether we're going to be around in 10,000 years or whatever it is. And you could have garden slugs that now are the fittest, that survive in the environment. Again, this is taking the strict naturalistic, Darwinistic type of view. So no, I would never agree with somebody that says it moves from an inferior to superior. Whatever fits, whatever survives in that particular environment. So in some respects, by its very definition, evolution is not necessarily linear progress.
And also that assumes that we are superior to other beings. Like, it's the human-centered narrative. Like, we are the peak of progress.
Yes.
Well, you'd have to go with civilizational, because the prior question would be if you're just talking about humans, if you're talking about other animals or creatures, and if you're just talking about humans, if it's an anthropic conversation, now you don't have to talk about any other creatures, just human beings, and then development and modernization and all that just is talking about ourselves. And that's why that second paragraph is so troubling to me. And actually the one that you didn't read there, Tim, the next one to finish off that self paragraph, first he quotes Niebuhr's, and that's the final part of that is to have one God is to have one history. And that's an important thing that's saying. He says that postmodernity undoes that, and I reject that. I think that's false. And then the last part of that is sort of like, what is he talking about? He says postmoderns, which is not postmodernists, but people in the postmodern era. That we have to, obviously, it's people today agree with Nietzsche that God, which is to say the supreme being of classical theism, so at least he said classical theism now. He doesn't mean evangelical Protestantism. He means classical theism. Has become unbelievable, as have the autonomous self and the meaning of history. And I just think that's nonsense. And this is where my push back.
How is that nonsense, given what we were just discussing about history and the self, though?
Wait, pause 1 second. It's in the context of being a postmodernist that would be nonsense. So I think you keep missing. I think you keep missing. He's saying, from this point of view, this is what's true. Not that you can't disagree with it. Not that there isn't a debate to be had. Just saying, if you're buying into my perspective, these are the things it consists of.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Also remember, as Van Hooser pointed out, and as I did on that one podcast I did on Heidegger, Nietzsche's word, the God is dead, is that it is the supreme supernatural being of classical theism.
Yeah.
That's what has died because we have killed him. We moderns.
Yeah, like the idea that religion is a less integral part of society and everyone's lives. Sort of like that. Right?
Formal religion,
like the full quote in the I don't remember the full quote in context, but he talks about how the old gods are dead and we have killed them. Like, there's a new, people are practicing their religion in a new way from the way that they used to.
Okay.
Yeah, I would jump to the 20th century. Marshall McLuhan talked about Nietzsche's God being the God of the Newtonian universe. And he said that God is dead, but the God of the Einsteinian universe is not dead. So we're talking in a quantum, then what do we mean by God? Heisenberg, I just think Van Hooser seems to be stuck in a narrative.
What's an Einsteinian God, and how is that different from a Newtonian God?
Mechanistic versus relativistic.
Okay.
So, sort of. Not. I mean, that's maybe a poor description of it, but in the Newtonian, everything is ordered.
Okay.
Okay. In the Einsteinian universe, no, it's not. Theory of relativity. Everything's relative, man. But you can even go beyond that and say there's the Whiteheadian conception of God. There's the postmodern theological conception of God, which we're going to get into in the later essays.
I don't know what that means. Yeah.
Well, that's why we got
So
all these
Whitehead's a
essays
good one
go
to
through.
bring up. Yeah, Whitehead's a good one to bring up there.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
McLuhan would disagree with what Van Hooser is saying here. But Shane is very right that Van Hooser is describing what he thinks it means, not necessarily validating. I just don't like that he's giving away too much. He's giving away things he shouldn't give away in what he's written so far. It seems to me anyway.
Well, he would say yes according to your perspective, just like how Shane says yes according to his perspective.
Yeah. But then he would succumb to the ideology that in fact wishes to oppose. So I don't think he actually wants to be a postmodernist.
How would he do that? How would he do that?
Well, he would reject postmodernism and say, I disagree with these things. And the postmodern condition, that's why it's interesting that he chose that he chose that term. It's sort of like this all-encompassing thing that you can't escape from. And then like, okay, thanks, but it's not really helping me because you're a bad sociologist. So don't try to, trick us with your, here's me understanding Foucault. No, you don't. I'm sorry, but there are other ways to get a better exit from Foucault's, mangled understanding of who we are, that you don't have to succumb to presenting it as if that's proven that we can't any longer believe in these things. No, it's not true. And a lot of places,
I really don't understand what you're saying at all.
Nor do I. I didn't follow any of that.
Okay.
Could we put a pin in this?
Okay.
Yeah, one time, yeah.
Okay. All right. So moving on, we'll go to the next section, a report on language and life. Okay. So another thing about postmodernism is, as Van Hoover says, the postmodern turn from meta-narrative to narrative may also be viewed as a turn from subjectivity to language. Whereas Heidegger chided modernity for forgetting the question of being, postmodern thinkers contend that what has actually been forgotten is language. The knowing subject of modernity, notice he says subject, the knowing subject of modernity assumed that reason was universal, impervious to differences of culture and language. For moderns, language was a transparent medium that enabled consciousness to grasp reality. Postmoderns find this picture of the mind-world relation incredible. Not only do we not have non-linguistic access to the way things are, but the way we speak and think is conditioned by the particular language in which we dwell. It is simply not the case that reality informs thought, and that thought informs language. Okay, Shane. Orthodoxy in the mysteries. What does it have to say about language?
Well, I don't think Andrew's going to like this, but
so let me say at the beginning is that language is inescapable to describe certain things. You said this at the top of the conversation. However, what does orthodoxy have to say about religious language or even biblical language?
God gives you direct access to truth. So
okay.
if you once you become spiritual, once you I think you purify, then you get illuminated, then you get deification. So purification is removing yourself from the passions. Illumination is developing the capacity to see the truth. Then you get deification, which is actually accessing God. Then you get to access the truth, and then the prophet's job is to turn that into things people can understand within their context. Let's say.
Okay.
So yes, you're still going to run into the linguistic trouble of getting on the same page. But I think what the Orthodox would say, because we're all made in the image of God, we all can access that truth as individuals and come to understand it. And that's how you get around this problem.
If you gain access to truth by removing yourself from the passions, that sounds oddly rationalistic based on the way that I understand your theology is.
Why would that be rationalistic? Sorry?
Isn't rationalism the part of an essential aspect of rationalism is removing yourself from the passions?
Rational. So, okay, I see what you're getting at there. What it would be is the passions would be like worldly manifestations. So they'd be temptations that would remove you from the truth or remove you from God or remove you from heaven, let's say.
Like the vices, greed, envy, sloth, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but also things like anger, or well, this would fit in there. So anything is Gregory, step in here. Is there a passion that wouldn't be a sin? No, he's not hearing me. Okay.
Be a sin.
But so I mean, yeah, because I think this is something I'm struggling with too, because I'm a very rationalistic, systematic thinker. You know, I'm relatively new to being a theist, so I'm still grappling with it myself. So I might say it wrong, but I think what they're trying to say is I guess through some spiritual phenomenon, you kind of can sidestep some of these needs to explain the world to yourself through rationality.
This sounds to me like almost exactly the same criticism that you guys have of so-called postmodernism.
In what sense?
That you like that one of your criticisms seems to be that they're advocating for adopting this particular ideology, and it'll have the answers to these problems that you're bringing up, which I don't think that it's doing. But if that's your theory, then it sounds like that's what you're doing in terms of Christianity.
I didn't quite follow the comparison. I'm sorry.
So it seems like you're saying that the so-called postmodernists are advocating for a particular ideology that can give us the answers to particular problems in the world that we're talking about, and that's what it seems to me like. That's what you're saying in terms of God and the truth. Like, we can only know the truth through God. That seems like the sort of narrative that.
What ideology is that?
Well, did you say postmodernism offers answers? That my contention is it doesn't offer answers. That's my problem.
That's what I'm saying. Oh, okay. Sorry. I thought that's one of the criticisms that you guys were offering.
Well, no.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Well, let me go back to language for a minute. So, what also comes to mind is what operates within Zen. So, don't know how much anybody knows about Zen. Is that Zen certainly does not rely on linguistic communication as a spiritual experience. In fact, they're actively against that. This is what the purpose of a koan is. A koan is a puzzle like, what was your face before you were born? Does a dog have the Buddha nature? What is the sound of one hand clapping? All of this is supposed to break you of your rationalistic, linguistic approach to things, and instead opening up your mind and your consciousness to actuality as it is. So it is definitely, yes, you have to rely a little bit on language because you have, Dogen, one of the Zen masters, left his talks. You write down the talks, and this is the transmission that happens. But you don't take it at face value. Certainly not. It's more of a, what's the word I'm looking for? An individual type of an experience. You become enlightened at some point, sort of spontaneously. Now, if I'm understanding you correctly, Shane, is that in Orthodoxy, the spiritual experience comes from, say, reading the Bible or reading the texts, but meditating on it. Maybe spontaneously it happens. And certainly one would hope that it happens during a liturgy. Am I sort of in the same ballpark?
As I understand it, and before I throw it back to Greg, because I think he can kind of clarify what I was saying more, because he's studied it more than I think in terms of the Zen example, that's what I'm coming to understand. The concept of the fall is leaving the Zen-like state that I think animals let's say rationality, pre-linguistics are in. Like, you just exist in reality. You're just right. You have like a one-to-one relationship with it. You're very integrated, and then eventually
you're in the moment.
You're in the moment, let's say, yeah. And I think part of what the fall represents is the idea that you now separated yourself from that, which would be unity with God, because you're unity with His creation. Again, the word's all wrong. It's something in that realm, but something about this rationality, these conceptions of good and evil, these words you're using divorce you from that, and you start creating, what ultimately create a lot of these things the postmodernists are complaining about. That's where that's going to lead, is you trying to build those constructs, with all the pitfalls that are going to have therein. So that's the best one.
That actually sounds really similar to, because I've read ahead in the book, that actually sounds pretty similar to later on where they actually start to describe postmodern theology. But yeah, like I said, that's getting ahead of where we are.
Yeah. I mean, for definitely one of the hallmarks of postmodern theology is apophantic theology, which is God, instead of God is, for example, God is not. Negative theology.
Right.
That's a hallmark.
Do you want me to jump in, Shane, coming back?
Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
Well, no, I would. There's also the term kenosis, but I would contend I don't know many apophatic Protestant theologians. I find it to be the opposite. I find it postmodern theology, if that's, I mean, Van Hooser's style, from what I'm aware of his other writings, that's a different story on that. But so I put those two quotes about God and grammar with Nietzsche, and then the empty. That sounds more like the postmodern. Like there's words can mean whatever you want. Linguistic relativism, and my question would be in this with way Van Hooser. I really dislike the way Van Hooser is leading this, but he's describing it. I still don't like how he's describing it, but he's bringing in the main things, like further than what Tim read is Derrida with that quote, there is nothing outside the text. So, okay, the death of the author, and then now there's no meaning anymore. And that's what this French postmodernist movement was aiming to do, all atheists. So I don't feel that in any way destroys or overcomes or makes irrelevant an entire conversation that they just kind of leave out and skip over, assuming that we go, language is now totally relativistic and authors don't matter. Whereas I just think it's nonsense. And being a postmodern doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a postmodernist. I think they confuse those.
The points. I think you're kind of oversimplifying some of the points that they make there. Like this idea that this is the way things are and you have to accept it. Like they're just describing things the way that they see them, like the way that they say what other people do. And I think also that's didn't we talk about this last time, Tim? That quote from Derrida, "There's nothing outside of the text," that's actually a misquote.
That is a misquote. The original French is "Il n'y a pas de hors texte." Hors texte is a compound word referring to outside text. That's a literal translation of it. One way you could also translate it as a context. It's not a text as a metaphysical thing. Well, of course everything exists without a text. Okay, but text or a context, a way of reading something. Okay, we have already seen this before. Is that we discussing this are already existing within a certain context. We're all North Americans. We were more or less raised in a mainline Christian denomination, be it Orthodox, Catholic, or whatever it is. We all speak English. We're not speaking another language or trying to translate one to the other. And we're all contemporaries. Okay? So there's already a context right there.
So is it more that there's no text outside of the context in which it was written?
Well, again, the context. I mean, the thing about text, what Derrida was getting at is, one thing that he definitely pointed out early in his career is this is where logocentrism comes in, which is prioritizing speech or the spoken word versus the text. That only spoken language, only speech reveals what the absolute truth is. And he questioned that, saying, well, what about texts? Texts are not necessarily derivative of anything. As a matter of fact, if the text is all that exists, many centuries after the author had put words to paper, or if you're if you're describing something like Van Hooser is of postmodernism, The text itself is already generating its own meanings. This is where all this, well, I don't like what Van Hooser is saying about this because, and you fill in the blank, because what you're already drawing from the text is more or less your own interpretations of an interpretation of an interpretation of an interpretation. This is what the heart of there is nothing outside of the outside text. Okay. We're trapped within textual, contextual descriptions.
Oh, okay. Because you can only write, because when you read something, you're only reading what's there on paper.
Sure. I mean, in the commentary, there are many commentaries out there about Aristotle, about Plato, about Foucault, whatever it is. You're not reading the actual text if you're reading a commentary. You're reading what somebody else had to say about the actual text.
Right.
Even within theology, concordances, interpretations of the books of the Bible. All these are interpretations. You're not reading the actual text itself.
Right.
And you're not reading the text in the original language unless you're schooled in Latin, Greek, Aramaic,
Right.
Russian. No.
Did I get?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Shane.
I was just gonna. So you can stop it if it's too much of a sidetrack. But in that definition of logocentrism, did he reduce logos just to like spoken word? Did I hear that correctly, or?
I think he means like arriving at the truth through spoken word. If correct me if I'm wrong, though.
Well, logos is word. Okay. And
Capital W word, though. It's
right, capital W word, and there are
Like
some
the word
religious
of God.
overtones there, just like in the Book of God. Jesus is the logos in the Book of John. The word became flesh and all that.
Well, like the
Okay.
word also creates the world. Like
Right.
he happens to speak the world into existence, but it's not like he's using like linguistic sentences to construct reality.
Right.
In that understanding of logos, like logos to me, for instance, is like the generative capacity to create is a big part of logos. It's the ability to, it's the ability to create is a big part of logos.
Yeah, and that's what speech was. So when one speaks, not just in delivering a speech, but when one speaks, one is creating the world.
But you can use the logos to action. So when Jesus raises somebody from the dead, now he often speaks when he does it. He says a word often, I'm pretty sure. So words, I think, are tied up in it. So it's not wrong to include word, but I think it goes far beyond just speaking.
Oh, sure, but within the context of what Derrida was getting at is the primacy of speech over the written text, where text is only derivative from speech. Therefore, text has has a role to play versus spoken within the context of philosophy, where he criticized that.
Okay. Could we go back to a second? Maybe Greg and/or Tim, you could clarify the meaning of kenosis and its relation to apophatic theology.
Greg, you can go ahead.
Okay, are you looking at I just wrote that one word down there in the text. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, kenosis.
Yeah.
Kenosis is the emptying, so it's usually in this context of theology, at least as far as I'm aware of it, in the concept of Christian theology, is that Christ emptied himself on the cross. Is the giving of himself. So the invisible God, but who is not seen, who with self. That's, as far as I understand it, kenosis. It's talked quite a bit now in terms of creation evolution discussions, and
I think kenosis also has the connotation of.
I don't.
I think kenosis also has the connotation of if you empty yourself of, let's say, your rationality or your linguistic understandings of the world,
your own will,
approach an understanding that's closer to God's understanding.
Yeah, actually, that's what I was thinking of in terms of what I read about this in the text as you guys were explaining it to me. Yeah, that I think they talk about that there.
Yeah, kenosis, Jesus emptying his own will so that he is a part of God's will.
Right.
Yeah, and that's how you can access capital T truth is through this emptying process. That's how you can escape. As I understand it, I could be wrong, but I think that's how they're trying to say you can escape the linguistics and rational traps and the limitations and the contradictions and all the legitimate criticism that postmodernism points out of modernism is through this process of kenosis, through this process of emptying, of prayer is a big way to do it. Ascetic living is a big way to do it. That's how you control the passions, is through an aesthetic living where you're not buying into all these worldly or materialistic or linguistic constructs. You're able to move past those, and obviously this gets into a belief of whether you actually think there's something beyond the material or whatnot, and I respect that some people don't see it that way, but as I understand it, that's what they're saying, is that's how you get closer to the truth. And that's why philosophy, I think, is so dangerous from their perspective, is because you end up getting trapped in your own constructions, um, with all the pitfalls that postmodernism would point out, as I understand it. So
That makes sense to me.
Okay. Can we press on?
Yeah.
All right.
Also, sorry, how does kenosis relate to apophatic theology?
Apophantic?
Apophantic, sorry. Because I know apophantic is more like negative theology, right? Like you're defining what God is not.
You have cataphatic. I'll just type it in as well, and apophatic.
Apophantic.
Yeah. Apophatic.
Yeah.
No N.
No N. Apophatic.
There's no N.
Yeah.
Apophatic.
Okay.
Apophatic.
I don't know what phatic means.
Every time I talk to
you're right, it's apophatic. My mistake.
The first thing they do is explain the difference between these two terms to me. Every time I ask them any question, they immediately go, "Oh, well, there's these two lenses," and they immediately explain this to me every single time. It's almost like the beam of my own mind.
It's so stark. It's such a stark contrast. At least experience, having lived in majority Protestant, majority Catholic, and majority Orthodox country. The Protestants are the least apophatic. And the more evangelical, the more cataphatic they are. Yeah. And the Catholics do have both, but the apophaticism, if that's even right to say, that's more of it's an Orthodox approach in theology. It seems to me, not entirely, not exclusively, but it's more common. And that's why, like Shane said about it, it's a contradistinction to the evangelicals. We don't want to go, hey, look, we have all this evidence here. Look, that might be the wrong, and maybe that's the way Van Hooser. We're early in the book, so I can't be critical. I don't know how kenosis comes in there.
Do you know that, Tim?
No, I don't see what the connection is. Kenosis is an activity. Apophatic is a type of theology.
Right. Okay.
Kenosis is a theological term. Okay. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't apply to God necessarily.
Particularly to Christian theology in this sense.
Yes, Christian theology.
You're not going to see, because you brought up Zen Buddhism, and I actually wanted even to comment on that, because if we're going to talk postmodern theology, then Buddhism doesn't count. So their view of language is different, and I've talked with quite a few Buddhists because I lived in a Buddhist country as well. Majority, that discussion of language is very, very different than if we're talking about theology.
Say what, Shane?
I'll just say, I don't know if you bring up China or India or anything in between in polite conversation. I think that's a bad joke, I guess. All right, go on.
Well, there might be an argument somewhere in this, but I know Tim wants to keep just quickly. It would be that for America would be towards Buddhism and away from Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, and maybe that's a condition of postmodern theology becoming untheological or non-theological, and that's the kind of thing they want to talk about. But otherwise, it's another, like, for me, like Shane said.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and put a pin in this. I mean, we'll have plenty of time as we're going through the book to discuss all the questions that we engender.
Okay.
All right. So pressing along, page 15. Let's focus on an iconoclastic purge, that section. So I'm going to try to go through this quickly here. Thou shalt not believe in absolutes. This postmodern imperative is allied to an iconoclastic urge. Okay. Shane, Greg, how would you define iconoclastic?
Shane?
Greg?
Oh, one of your audios are breaking up.
Yes. Well, before they come back
The
online.
breaking of icons.
Yes, the breaking of icons.
There.
The smashing of icons.
Yeah, the break. Well,
Okay.
allied to and am I mute? Shane, are you there? The breaking, smashing of icons, Shane.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm just trying to get a better connection. Go ahead, Greg.
Well, iconoclasm, like it sounds like it's sort of like like he means it that postmodern is iconoclastic, which means anti-religious almost. That's the reading I get in that.
Right. So there's religious overtones here, but it's also against other kinds of icons, such as capital R reason. We're against that.
Right.
So that Van Hooser continues, Lyotard not only finds it impossible to believe in meta-narratives, but accuses meta-narratives of being crimes against humanity. Strong language here. Why? Because meta-narratives, absolute truths, fund various forms of totalitarianism. The ideology you shall always have with you, what is going on today in religion, art, philosophy, and thinking in general, is a cleansing of the temples of knowledge, of the last vestiges of conceptual idolatry. The postmodern condition is one of life among the ruins of cast-down idols, especially in the ruins of cast-down isms, for example, existentialism, structuralism, Marxism. For postmodern iconoclasts, do not abandon reason. Let me read that again. For postmodern iconoclasts, do not abandon reason. They merely remove it from its pedestal and situate it. To locate an ideology or conceptual system in the rough and tumble of human history, culture, and politics is, of course, to demystify it. Henceforth, there are, quote, only human, all too human, that's a Nietzschean quote, isms. Iconoclastic suspicion is a radicalization of Kant's attempt to determine the limits of reason. The result, a postmodern critique of impure reason.
Okay.
Okay, so that's the iconoclasm. I think that's self-explanatory. Moving right along. A return of the repressed. Okay. So he says, modern systems can only master reality by excluding what does not fit. That which falls outside our conceptual systems is thus deemed irrational or is unscientific. This was the great paradox of the modern desire for mastery. Common to several currents of postmodern thought is anti-systemic impulse, a predilection for the plural, the multiple, a valorization of everything that has been suppressed by earlier systematicity, everything that has been left out or relegated to the margins. Okay. So then continuing, we've covered this once before, Andrew, with postmodernism. Concern for the other is the major theme of the work of Emmanuel Levinas, for whom ethics, an infinite respect for the irreplaceable other, replaces epistemology as first philosophy. Whereas modern systems tend violently to absorb the other, ideas or persons, into comprehensive schemes, Levinas contends that one's first responsibility is to let the other be rather than to cast the other in one's own image. One's obligations toward the other cannot be calculated. Ethics is not about moral systems or following rules. It is rather about respecting particularity and difference. So Shane, what does Orthodox have to say about the other? Does it is the project to incorporate and subsume the other, or is it to respect the other and acknowledge the other first?
I think it's to respect the other. So there's this this priest I go listen to talks most weeks he gives, and he was talking about the judge not lest ye be judged, take the plank out of your own eye before seeing the splinter in the others. And part of what he was talking about was how when you judge somebody else, so let's say when you try to subsume the other inside your schema, would be another way of saying it. I think it's consistent. It actually blinds you to who that person is, because now you put them into this box. And I think from my understanding of having listened to Orthodox, they put primacy on not judging other people, not only because it blinds you to them, but because you have so much work to do on yourself. So the emphasis is really more upon, you have your own relationship with God, your own relationship with your own concepts, work that out. That's going to be your path to salvation. Your response to other people is not supposed to be judgment, but love. So I think in a certain respect, trying to force them into your schema is this type of judgment you're not supposed to engage in. So I think that I haven't quite figured it out, because you're allowed to assess for your own purposes how to react to people. So that's like a form of judgment. So obviously the other, or you're going to have to build practical schemas by definition to operate in the world. But I think there's a type of judgment where you put like a moral argument, or you get, or maybe this is what it is you have to be humble in those assessments. So fair enough, if you want to build a schema that incorporates the other, I think you have to do it very humbly or lightly, because otherwise I think you're taking on a level of lordship or pride that you're not really allowed to have. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my best response to it.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
Okay, Greg, got anything to add?
Not on the self, maybe on the repressed part and the other part, but on the I was quiet there. On the not on the repressed part, but on the iconoclastic part. I mean, he raises this sort of necessity of having these absolute truths be vanquished, be defeated by ideology, and the focus he put, like, ideology's come up here quite a bit already, but this statement, and I believe in absolutes. Peter Kreft is a Catholic philosopher, and he compares relativism and absolutism, and he says absolutism is relatively absolute, but relativism is absolutely relativistic.
Yes,
But
I like that definition.
But he's not being relativistic here.
Well, that's like when you see this, like almost like, let's take it to a higher level of language, thou shalt not, right? And that's how he starts it. And he says, that's gone. Postmodern rejects that, and it breaks it like an icon. I think the only alternative that we have available one of the alternatives at least is that then therefore truth is relative. Therefore,
but
God.
It's not that it's relative, though. It's not that it's relative, though. It's that there are pluralities. It's not like the only answer to absolutism is not relativism. It's pluralism, like many different ways of looking at things, not just one, but not just that all of them are equal necessarily either. That's not the argument.
So you don't you reject that absolute and relative are opposites. You think that that the alternative is better, or can there be multiple opposites here?
That's what I'm saying. Multiple possibilities.
Yeah. Yeah, I can accept pluralism then. Yeah, I don't see the iconoclasm as so definitive as he makes it, although because I think he's setting it up for, we have an alternative to this, and that's what it is, and here's my thing, and that's his theology. But I would say he's giving away too much and saying things he shouldn't.
Like what?
And concluding, that phrase in there, the ideology you shall always have with you. Well, okay, yeah, great. He's just quoting people that I quite fundamentally in some ways disagree with strongly, and I believe there's a better way to talk about it than to go to these people. So I don't know why he would be sticking on them as if they're defining where we are when we've gone past it. That's the hard part for me.
Aren't you yourself continuously saying that people have ideologies, though? I don't understand why you have a problem with that point.
It's okay as long as we're clear that the ideology we're getting here from the people. So we've had Foucault, we've had Kant, we've had Hegel, we've had Marx, we've had Heidegger. As long as we're aware, and it hasn't been spelled out here very definitively, they're all atheists, and the ideology they're presenting, within which they're saying ideology defines everything you think, is the ideology of atheism. And if we don't put that up there, then we lose the fact.
They're not offering atheism, though.
Well, behind all of their writings, that's their worldview. So they're not
But that,
writing
but you're
against their worldview.
you're psychologizing them, like to say that because people are atheists, that means that the writer here is advocating for atheism. Like a lot of the people he uses as examples, like not like even if all of them were atheists, that he's clearly not explicitly arguing for atheism here, and I don't think he is implicitly either. Especially since I've read like most of the rest of the book, but this is like they go through many different types of theologies in here too. To be fair,
well, Vancouver's not Van Hooser himself's not an atheist, so I certainly don't think he's promoting it. But in what we're reading here, the postmodern condition, postmodernism, etc., is being defined by atheists. Is that correct? Could we agree that that's the way he's presenting it? Is postmodernism is coming out of the words of atheists? I haven't seen, at least not yet, in the text, a religious person saying, "Here's what postmodernism means. Here's what the meaning of being a postmodern person means." Have we seen it yet? I don't think so.
Well, if I may interject, if I may interject really quickly, is the way I would raise those kind of concerns, Gregory, is when I would ask a question about, are they operating in a naturalistic framework? So, for like
you did ask that, yeah.
And the purposes of conversation, like rather than say, I feel this, I suspect that, I don't like this angle of it, like to actually be able to have a conversation about it, you'd have to pick a specific point and, you know, give us a little tidbit that we can rally around, right? Because yes, we can say in general they might have this overarching framework, but what's the implication on the exact point or an exact observation, so we can discuss it. I mean, yes, given that there might be implications, whatnot, but if it's not concretized to a specific thing, then for the purposes of conversation doesn't really get us anywhere per se, right? So,
I don't have a problem with the way that Greg is raising these points. I disagree with him. That's all.
I would also add is that who has been mentioned so far, they might not be atheists. They could be agnostics. That would, because a philosopher could be a believer but has nothing to say about God, really.
Yeah. They're not agnostic about postmodernism. They're trying to give content to that. So, but that point is valid. Yeah, sure. I don't know of any of that Kant was not an atheist, so I correct myself on that. Marx was. Hegel was not an atheist either. So
Derrida wasn't necessarily either.
No, neither was Levinas.
Levinas was not, and Ricoeur was not as well.
No.
So yeah, it's not fair to say postmodernism is just atheism. That wasn't the point that I was making. But because they're bringing up ideology in here, I think it's important that we understand the ideologies that they're also raising in here and how they impact their view of what postmodernism is. Because I would say, like, I have no problem whatsoever being a postmodern religious theist. I don't see any contradiction at all in that. And it's almost like they're making the claim here, but I haven't read the rest of the book, but that this can't happen anymore. And I think there were movements of people that made claims like this, but I don't think it was taken on. Yeah. Anyway, probably good to carry on.
Yeah, we'll put a pin in that. All right, continue on. Next session, a recovery of messianic religion. Okay, so Van Hooser says, one candidate for, quote, most repressed other in modernity is religion. At the very least, a strident secularism has kept religion out of the public square. The so-called fact-value distinction relegated faith to the margins of private preferences. Postmoderns have played Hamlet to modernity's Horatio, insisting, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. Postmoderns gesture not only in the direction of the other, but also toward the beyond. In Graham Ward's words, quote, the emergence of the postmodern has fostered post-secular thinking. Let me read that again. The emergence of the postmodern has fostered post-secular thinking. In particular, the postmodern condition has enabled the recovery of two neglected forms of religious discourse, the prophetic and the mystical, that seek in different ways to invoke the beyond, justice, the gift. Okay, continuing. Even Derrida in his later work has begun to speak of something that is beyond deconstruction. Better, deconstructive analysis is undertaken in the name of something affirmatively undeconstructible. This something, it turns out, is justice. Indeed, Derrida goes so far as to say that deconstruction is justice. Everything depends, however, on his distinction between justice and law. Law refers to the formulas and structures that make up some judicial system. The law is deconstructible because it is constructed in the first place, historically instituted and constituted. In short, law is always situated, and hence prone to partiality. One deconstructs the law in the name of a justice to come, a justice beyond present human formulations. Justice is what the deconstruction of the law means to bring about. This is not to say that Derrida knows exactly what justice looks like. Indeed, justice for Derrida is the impossible, in the sense that it is incalculable on the basis of factors that are already present. Nevertheless, deconstruction is the desire that justice is to come. And continuing, another religious theme that has received much attention of late is that of the gift. For Derrida, the gift is as impossible as justice. As soon as we give something to someone, we put that person in our debt, thus taking, not giving. The gift disappears in a web of calculation, interest, and measure. Such is the aporia of the gift, according to Derrida. It cannot be given without creating an economy, a system of calculation and exchange, of debt and gratitude. It is reintroduced into the cycle of an exchange and destroyed as a gift. Can a gift be given in modern societies ruled by various forms of exchange? Morality and other forms of social convention work with a logic of equivalence. However, the true gift is always extravagant, exceeding what is strictly required. Can the gift be thought? Only an expenditure without reserve, a giving that expects no reciprocity, a giving that forgets a gift has been given, would seem to measure up to Derrida's requirements for a true gift. Neither justice nor the gift is, strictly speaking, of this world, yet are both that for which postmoderns hope. Okay.
I have to get going soon, guys, but I
Sure.
wanted to so I'm a little confused by what he means by post-secular, what he means by and what he means by deconstruction is justice. I like what he said about the idea of the gift there, though.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me see if I can unpack that. So, at one time we had a religious culture. Then we had secularization, and now in a secular culture. That's modernity, one of the hallmarks of modernity. Van Hooser said in the beginning that religion was one of the repressed ones. As modern society secularized, it sort of repressed and pushed aside religion. Not to say that people weren't religious or that people didn't practice religion, but it became more personal than it became widespread, that it became political type of thing. And then with some people, they became atheists. Religion doesn't matter in their lives. They're completely and utterly secular. It's fine. It happens. But with postmodernity, now we're dealing with a post-secular type of culture where modernity cracking up, breaking down, becomes re-enchanted, to use the Bauman term. Now we're going into a post-secular world. So maybe religion is experiencing a resurgence, but it can't go back to what it once was. So instead of, we really like to focus on the law. Law really ties very much into an organized religion. What's an organized religion? Let's look at the par excellence is the Jewish law, customs. You cannot do this, the 10 Commandments, these are the law. Okay, this is set down. Law is constructed, according to Derrida. So therefore it can be deconstructed. And instead of law, which is formalistic, we're looking for justice. But what's justice? There's a big question mark behind that. Maybe one can't really define.
Question.
maybe one can't really define justice. Justice is more of an action. Justice you can define if you can define it in terms of the results of an action. Hard to say. Shane, Greg, you guys got any input on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, when he first said that postmodern was concerned about justice, I kind of scoffed because I have a lot of like baggage there. But in terms of when he kept going, it actually makes a lot of sense because we were looking at the Bible study yesterday. We were looking at Jesus interacting with the Pharisees. So Pharisees are always saying, "Well, the law says you can't do this on the Sabbath, right?"
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And Jesus is always deconstructing that in the sense that he's like, "Well, you guys circumcise on the Sabbath. That's not that's against the commandments, and you guys have the circumcision. It's nowhere in your law. So, but I'm healing a man. So why? So you can do your little religious ceremony of circumcision. That's fine, breaking the commandments on the Sabbath. But I save somebody who's broken, and that's not okay, right? And this is where he's kind of chiding them about their legalistic way of interacting with things, and he's deconstructing that in the sense that you can't hide behind the law. And you need to, because justice is something that exists in a way you can't put down into terms, right? And then I liked how he moved into the idea of the gift, because often the best thing to do is to respond with love, and I understand the Christian conception of love to be charity, which means giving in a sacrificial way.
Right.
So I think a lot of so that's
right.
Yeah, go on.
That's
so
interesting.
Yeah, so what he was getting at with the gift is for something to be designated as a gift, there is an economy that has to exist first. But what we're reaching towards is a gift that is given freely, that is not within an economy, and that there's no expectation of anything in return.
Which is love.
Which is love, yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
so that whole section sounded to me to be like ridiculously Christian in terms of how I understand religion to be completely consistent. I was quite surprised. So
right now
like that.
we're focusing on Derrida, right? Which is this is his later work. Now Van Hooser mentions that this is in 2003, so Derrida is still alive at this time. He dies a couple of years later. This is definitely in his later work where Derrida seems to take more of a religious approach to things, even though he himself was raised as a non-observant secular Jew, which he kind of was a Jew more or less of his life, but he always had this tension between himself and his Jewishness. And then, as we covered last time with that one essay in the Cambridge Companion about the whole thing about Jew-Greek, the term Jew-Greek, you remember that? Which is this conflict between the Jewishness and Greek, meaning Western philosophy, in one sense. Rationalization, categorization types of things. This is that conflict where the point is to transcend the both of those, becoming Jew-Greek.
Okay.
Greg, you got anything to say about justice and the gift?
Yeah, I don't like Derrida. So I just.
And on that note,
I do.
Yeah.
Okay. So Andrew, you got to go, and
I'll
I'm starting
be gentle with that.
Yeah, I'm starting to get sleepy. So how about we break for now? We'll resume this in another time. The second part.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun, guys. I really enjoyed this one in particular. That was great.
Okay.
All right.
So what do you think? What do you think,
guys.
Greg? Do you have enough? You have enough gumption and fortitude to come back for another one?
Well, I'm glad to. Yeah, this is great. It's a good topic, and there's lots of stuff, lots of juicy things to open up in there. So, and I appreciate your guys' points of view and open up new things for me to see tonight. So I'm glad. I'm thankful for that.
Yeah,
Same to you, man.
I'll shoot an invite to the group chat then, so we can kind of follow things there.
Yeah. Okay, Andrew, take us out.
All right. Yeah. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, guys. That was really fun and interesting. And yeah, like I always say, thanks everyone for watching another episode of Mindgasms podcast. And thank you so much to all of you who like and subscribed to my channel, or like this video rather. And to those of you who share this and comment on the video to say what you think too. And especially thank you to those of you who contribute to me on Patreon. I really appreciate that. And I'll put the link in the description of this video like I always do. And then also, like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all. All right. And all right. Thanks, everyone. And adios until next time.